The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes every breath feel too loud, every movement too sharp. All eyes were on the defendant's chair, and the tension in the air was heavy enough to choke. But the moment I stepped inside, the silence broke into something else. Confusion, disbelief, shock. The judge's gavel slipped from his hand and clattered onto the desk, echoing across the room like a thunderclap. He froze, staring at me as though he had seen a ghost. His face turned pale, his lips parted, but no words came out. Around him, lawyers whispered, jurors shifted uncomfortably, and the spectators gasped. Nobody had expected me. Nobody had thought I would be here. For weeks, the case had dominated the headlines. The accusations were sharp, the evidence damning, and the verdict seemed inevitable. But everything the court thought it knew was about to change. The truth, the real truth, had been buried for years. Hidden behind lies, manipulation, and betrayal. And I was the one person who carried the proof that could unravel it all. The judge looked at me like he recognized something no one else could see. A memory or a mistake that had come back to life. My very presence in that courtroom was more powerful than any testimony, more explosive than any piece of evidence. They didn't know who I really was, what role I had played in the shadows of this story. But they were about to find out. And when they did, everything, the case, the lies, the lives of everyone in that room, would shatter beyond repair. Because the truth was far darker, far more shocking, than anyone had ever dared to imagine. And I was the one who had come to reveal it. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old secrets, a heavy mix of dust, paper, and faint perfume from the spectators that lingered like a ghost in the air. My steps echoed on the marble floor as I pushed the heavy doors open, and for a fleeting moment, all the sound drained out of the world. Dozens of eyes turned in my direction, curious at first, then unsettled, and finally locked in a state of stunned disbelief. The hum of low conversation died like someone had snuffed out a flame. I kept walking forward, my heartbeat steady but my stomach twisting with the weight of the moment. I could feel their stares crawling over me, whispering in silence. But the only pair of eyes I cared about were the judges, and when I met them, I saw everything I had expected and dreaded. Recognition, shock, and a kind of fear that slipped through the cracks of his carefully constructed mask. He froze, absolutely still, as though the world itself had turned him into stone. The gavel that had been resting in his right hand slipped from his grip and clattered against the wooden bench with a sharp, hollow crack that echoed through the room. The sound should have been small, forgettable, but in that moment it rang like thunder, tearing through the silence. I heard gasps from the jury box, murmurs ripple through the spectators, and the prosecutor half rose from her seat, glancing at me, then at the judge, then back again. Nobody could understand what was happening, not yet. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know why my presence had just drained the color from the judge's face. But they would. I walked slowly, carefully, each step deliberate, though inside I was carrying the weight of years, years of silence, of being ignored, of being erased. My palms were slick with sweat, but I refused to let my hands tremble. I had rehearsed this moment in my head too many times. If I showed weakness, if I looked small, they would doubt me, just like they had before. Had to be strong. I had to be louder than the lies that had buried me. The accused sat at the defense table, his head snapping up as the doors opened. At first, his expression was confusion, maybe annoyance, like he was wondering who dared to interrupt the most important trial of his life. But then, when recognition dawned, his features twisted into something darker. Hatred. Panic. He shifted in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though he could hold himself together by sheer force. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering frantically, but he didn't respond. He couldn't take his eyes off me. It was the same look I had seen before, years ago when he thought he had destroyed me, when he thought he would never see me again. The bailiff called my name, a name that hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unfamiliar to most in the room but heavy with history for the two men whose faces betrayed everything. I could hear whispers among the reporters in the back rows, pens scribbling furiously, cameras shifting on their tripods to capture this unexpected turn. They had been following this trial for weeks, building headlines, painting the accused as either a monster or a misunderstood man depending on which side sold more copies. But none of them had been prepared for this. I took my seat in the witness box, my heart steady now, my breathing even. The clerk handed me the Bible, and I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The irony was not lost on me. I had been trying to tell the truth for years, screaming it into empty rooms, into deaf ears, into walls built by powerful men who decided which truths deserved light and which deserved silence. Now, finally, I was sworn to do the very thing I had been denied all this time. When I lifted my eyes again, the judge still hadn't fully recovered. His hands were clasped too tightly on the bench, his knuckles pale. He cleared his throat, tried to adjust his robe, but his eyes flickered with guilt, flickered with memory. He knew who I was, and I knew he wished I had never come. The prosecutor stepped forward, papers trembling slightly in her hands as she adjusted her notes. She hadn't expected me. I wasn't on her witness list. I wasn't supposed to be here. The defense team looked equally blindsided, flipping through their files as though somewhere, in all those folders and documents, they might find a way to explain me away. But they wouldn't. There was no piece of paper, no fabricated evidence, no half-truth that could erase the fact of my existence. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor asked, her voice cautious. I said it slowly, clearly, letting it hang in the air long enough for every ear in the room to register it. A murmur rippled across the spectators, like a sudden breeze through tall grass. The reporters recognized it. They were trained to. I saw their pens stop mid-scratch, their heads lift, their eyes widen. Some began whispering to each other, piecing together old stories, rumors, forgotten cases. My name wasn't new. It had been buried, pushed aside, but it had once carried weight. And now it was back, louder than ever. The accused shifted again, finally snapping out of his frozen state. He leaned toward his lawyer, hissing something sharp and angry. The lawyer tried to calm him, but he shoved the man's hand away. His composure was gone. He looked like a man whose carefully built house of lies had just been set on fire, and he could already smell the smoke. The judge banged his gavel, forcing the room back into silence, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Order in the court," he said, though it sounded less like authority and more like a plea. He was losing control and he knew it. I folded my hands on my lap, feeling the weight of every eye pressing into me. The world wanted answers. Who was I? Why was I here? What truth could I possibly hold that had the power to make a judge tremble and a criminal sweat? The prosecutor took a breath, steadied herself, and asked the question that would open the first crack in the wall of lies. "Can you tell the court how you know the defendant?" The words hit like a drumbeat, steady and certain. My answer when it came was simple, but it sliced through the air like glass. "I know him," I said, my voice even, strong and final, "because I was the one he tried to destroy." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, questions, all rising at once, a storm of disbelief. The judge shouted for order. The bailiff moved to control the crowd, and the defense lawyer demanded a mistrial. But none of it mattered. The silence that followed belonged to me. I sat there, my body still, my face calm, but inside I felt years of pain lifting like chains snapping one by one. The truth had finally stepped into the light, and nothing, not lies, not fear, not power, could drag it back into the dark. The sound in the courtroom after my words was like an explosion that wouldn't die down, a storm that refused to settle. Reporters practically lunged forward in their seats, their pens scratching furiously, cameras clicking despite the judge's furious commands for silence. The accused, Michael, couldn't hide himself anymore. His face twisted into something primal, his voice rising in a broken, furious shout that startled even his own defense team. "Lies! Every word is a lie!" he bellowed, slamming his hand against the table so hard that papers flew onto the floor. The jury recoiled, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while the prosecutor raised her hand, almost like a conductor trying to bring order to a wild orchestra. But all I could see was Michael, His rage uncoiling, the mask he had worn so carefully for years shattering in front of everyone. The judge banged his gavel over and over, the sharp crack echoing like gunfire, but his voice carried no real authority anymore. "Order! Order in this court!" he shouted, but even as he said it, his eyes flicked toward me with a kind of recognition that couldn't be erased. He knew this wasn't just another witness, another piece of testimony to be filed away. He knew that my very presence threatened to drag out the skeletons he had buried along with Michael's crimes. He was sweating beneath his robe, his jaw tight, and though he tried to mask it, I saw the tremor in his hand as he adjusted his glasses. The prosecutor took a cautious step toward me, her papers rustling. She looked younger in that moment, not the fierce attorney the headlines had painted her as, but a woman suddenly aware that the ground beneath her trial was shifting. "Please," she said, her voice steadier than her eyes, "explain to the court what you mean. What do you mean he tried to destroy you?" I inhaled slowly, every breath heavy with years of silence. I could feel the weight of every person in that room pressing down on me, waiting, demanding to know what I would say next. I turned my eyes toward Michael. He was staring back at me with a fury that was almost physical, like he could burn through me with nothing but hate. But beneath that rage was fear, pure, undeniable fear. He knew what was coming. He knew I had survived, that I carried pieces of his past he had sworn would never see daylight. "He isn't the man he pretends to be," I said, my voice clear and steady. "He built his life on lies, on the pain of others. He tried to erase me. He almost succeeded." I let the words hang in the air long enough for them to seep into every corner of the courtroom. The gasps and murmurs rose again, but this time I didn't wait for silence. I was there when it began. "I know what he did. And I have the proof." Michael shot to his feet, his lawyer grabbing his arm desperately to pull him back down. "You don't know anything," he screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. "You're nothing, nothing but a bitter liar who crawled out of the dirt." His lawyer hissed at him to sit down, but he was past the point of strategy now. His composure was gone, stripped away in front of the very people who would decide his fate. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, waiting for him to control the outburst, but the judge was frozen again, pale as marble, gripping the bench so tightly I wondered if he thought he could anchor himself to it. He cleared his throat, forced his gavel down, and barked, "The defendant will remain silent." His voice cracked on the word silent, betraying the fact that silence was the very thing that had allowed this all to fester for years. When the courtroom finally stilled, I leaned forward, my voice lowering, not louder but sharper, cutting through the silence like a blade. "He told everyone I was gone, that I would never speak again. He wanted me erased. But here I am, and I will not be silent anymore." I could see the jury's faces shifting, their skepticism melting into curiosity, then into something more dangerous for Michael, belief. They wanted to hear more. They wanted me to continue, and I intended to. The prosecutor, still visibly shaken by the sudden turn of events, finally found her footing. She stepped closer, her voice firmer now. "You said you have proof. Can you show the court what you mean?" I nodded slowly. From the folder I carried pressed against my chest, I withdrew a stack of papers, old, worn, but meticulously preserved. I handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the prosecutor. She flipped through them quickly, her eyes widening as she realized what they were. Letters, records, photographs, things that tied Michael not just to me but to others, people who had vanished, people whose voices had been silenced. The defense lawyer shot up, shouting objections, his voice shrill, his words stumbling over themselves. "This is outrageous, unverified, irrelevant." But the panic in his tone betrayed him. He hadn't expected this. Nobody had. The judge tried to sound stern as he overruled, but even his words shook. He knew what was in those papers, or at least enough to understand the weight they carried. His eyes darted away from me every time I looked at him, but he couldn't hide the truth written on his face. As the prosecutor read aloud one of the letters, my handwriting, my words, written years ago when I had begged for help that never came, the silence in the courtroom deepened. My voice came back to me through her reading, a younger version of myself crying out for justice, ignored by those who should have listened. Some of the jurors looked down, their jaws tight. The spectators shifted uncomfortably, the reality of neglect and corruption settling like a shadow over everyone. Michael's face was red with fury, his body shaking as though he might leap across the table, but his lawyer held him back. His mask was gone now, torn away, and what was left was raw and ugly. He couldn't hide behind charm, behind money, behind carefully crafted lies. The truth was bleeding into the open, and he couldn't stop it. For the first time I allowed myself to glance at the judge again, really look at him. His face was strained, his lips pressed tight, but his eyes, those eyes betrayed everything. Guilt, regret, and something else. Recognition. He remembered me not as a stranger, not as just another name, but as a person whose cries he had chosen to ignore. He had buried me alongside Michael's crimes, and now, as the letters came to life in front of everyone, his silence was on trial too. I leaned back in my seat, my voice steady as I spoke again. I begged for justice years ago. Nobody listened. The system protected him, not me. The truth was silenced, not because it wasn't there, but because it was easier for powerful men to pretend it didn't exist. The courtroom was a storm held barely in check, tension straining at every seam. And though the chapter of my testimony had only just begun, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a trial about Michael's crimes. This was about the rot in the very walls of the court, the silence that had allowed him to thrive. And with every word I spoke, the cracks in that silence grew wider, the courtroom had grown colder, as though the air itself had shifted under the weight of what I had revealed. Nobody moved freely anymore. Even the reporters, usually shameless in their scramble for stories, had become careful, their pens slower, their eyes wider, as though afraid that if they blinked they might miss something that would change everything. The jury leaned forward, each of them caught in the web of words that had begun to unravel Michael's carefully spun image. But the truth was not just about Michael, it was about the world that had enabled him. And as I sat in the witness box, looking into those faces, I realized that my testimony was no longer just about survival. It was about exposing the rot that had hidden in plain sight for years. The prosecutor, visibly steadier now, held another letter from the stack I had provided. She read it aloud in a voice that trembled slightly but grew stronger with every word. Words written in desperation, words begging for someone, anyone, to believe me. It was the voice of my younger self, trapped in fear, silenced by threats, and betrayed by the very people who had sworn to uphold justice. My chest tightened as I listened, not because I regretted the words but because they carried me back to nights I had spent staring at locked doors, listening for footsteps, praying for dawn to come. I forced myself to hold the gaze of the jury, to show them that I had survived those nights, even if the scars still lived under my skin. Michael laughed bitterly, a sound that was sharp and hollow, breaking the fragile silence like glass shattering. Letters. Old words on paper. That's your proof, he sneered, his voice carrying the arrogance that had once convinced so many people to believe him. Anyone could have written those. She's desperate, inventing stories because she has nothing else. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering furiously, but Michael shoved him away, his anger spilling unchecked. The more he spoke, the more his mask crumbled, until he looked less like a man defending himself and more like a cornered predator lashing out at anything that threatened to expose him. The judge banged his gavel again, but even he seemed weary now, his commands for silence brittle, breaking as soon as they were spoken. I could see sweat glistening at his temples, his throat tightening each time the prosecutor brought forward another piece of evidence, each time I spoke another truth that he could no longer hide behind his silence. He had thought his years of ignoring the truth would vanish into history, but history has a way of clawing its way back when it's been buried alive. The prosecutor turned to me once more. "Can you tell the court," she asked carefully, "what exactly you meant when you said the defendant tried to erase you? What happened?" The question felt like a door unlocking inside me, and for a moment I froze, staring down at my hands. They were steady, but inside me, memories rose like shadows that had been waiting in the corners of my mind. The courtroom leaned closer without moving, the silence begging me to continue. I lifted my head, my voice lower now, almost quiet, but the kind of quiet that makes people lean in, that forces them to listen. "He didn't just want me silenced," I said. "He wanted me gone. Completely. I was young, too young, and I trusted the wrong people. He used that trust, twisted it until I was trapped. I told the truth back then, too. I went to the police. I went to the courts. I thought someone would listen." My eyes shifted briefly toward the judge, and his gaze fell to his desk. But nobody did. The case was buried. My words were dismissed. I was told there wasn't enough evidence, told to move on, told that men like him couldn't be touched. I heard gasps, faint but sharp, from the spectators. The jury looked shaken, but they did not look away. Some of them glanced toward the judge, and for the first time, suspicion flickered in their eyes. The weight of silence was shifting, tilting toward the one man who had the power to have stopped it years ago but hadn't. Michael slammed his fist against the table again. His face red with fury. "Lies. All of it. She's fabricating everything. This is nothing but a circus," he shouted, but his words no longer carried authority. They carried desperation. The prosecutor ignored him and motioned for me to continue. I told them about the nights, the endless nights where I lived in fear, every sound outside my window making me jolt awake. I described the threats, the phone calls that came at strange hours, the shadows that lingered too close to my door. I told them how people I once thought were my friends had turned their backs on me, too afraid of Michael's influence, too afraid of what would happen to them if they stood by me. My voice stayed steady, though inside me each memory twisted like a knife. But I refused to stop. I would not let those memories stay hidden in the dark any longer. The prosecutor presented photographs next. Grainy, old, but real. They showed me in places I shouldn't have been, with people I hadn't chosen, moments that had been used to discredit me when I had first tried to speak. Michael had arranged them to look like evidence of lies back then. But now, in the light of the truth, they showed something different. Proof of manipulation, proof of being trapped. The jury whispered among themselves, their faces hardening. Michael's lawyer objected over and over, his voice strained, his motions frantic, but each time the prosecutor countered with calm precision, armed with facts that sliced through every attempt to cover the truth. The judge looked like a man drowning. His robe seemed heavier, his shoulders bent, and though he tried to keep his expression neutral, he failed. His eyes betrayed him every time they flicked toward the photographs, every time my voice carried through the courtroom. He remembered. He knew these pieces weren't new. They had been presented before years ago when I had begged for justice. And he had turned them away. He had chosen silence. And now, that silence was cracking apart for the world to see. I begged him to stop, I said, my voice stronger now, cutting through the tension. I begged the system to protect me. But nobody listened. They told me to disappear, to stay quiet, to move on with my life as if nothing had happened. He counted on that silence. He thrived on it. And he destroyed others because of it. The air was heavy with the weight of my words, but I didn't stop. I wasn't the only one, I continued. There were others. Some vanished. Some never spoke again. But I survived. And I'm here because I will not let them be forgotten. He tried to erase me. But all he did was give me the reason to fight harder. The courtroom erupted again, gasps and whispers flooding the room like waves. The judge banged his gavel uselessly, his voice cracking as he demanded silence. Michael shouted curses at me, his lawyer burying his head in his hands. The prosecutor stood taller now, her confidence rising with every crack in Michael's composure, every tremor in the judge's voice. And I sat there, unflinching, my voice the only steady thing in the storm. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one drowning. Michael was. The judge was. And the truth was finally clawing its way out of the dark, The air in the courtroom had grown suffocating, as though every secret being dragged into the open thickened the atmosphere until even breathing felt heavy. The jurors sat rigid in their seats, pens long forgotten, eyes locked on me as though I held the key to a door they were terrified to open but couldn't look away from. Michael's lawyer looked exhausted, his face pale. His notes scattered across the table like the remnants of a war he knew he was losing. And Michael himself. He was no longer a man holding his ground. He was unraveling, his arrogance stripped away, his fury spilling out in violent bursts that only revealed his guilt more clearly. His eyes burned into me like embers, but his fire no longer frightened me. For the first time he looked small, cornered, powerless, and desperate. The prosecutor cleared her throat, steadying herself. She had grown stronger with each moment of this unexpected storm, her voice more confident, her presence firmer, as though she had realized that I wasn't tearing apart her case. I was strengthening it. "You've shown us letters, records, and testimony," she said carefully. "But you said you had proof. Proof that cannot be denied. What did you mean?" I looked at her, then at the jury, and finally at the judge. He froze under my gaze, his lips pressed tight, his fingers trembling against the wooden bench. He already knew what was coming. His face said it all. For a heartbeat, I almost pitied him. Almost. But pity had no place here. Silence had cost too much. I reached into my folder once more, my hand steady this time, and withdrew a small collection of photographs and official documents bound together with a faded ribbon. The bailiff carried them to the prosecutor, and the moment she flipped through them, her jaw tightened, her eyes flashing wide. She looked back at me, as though asking silently if she truly understood what she was holding. I nodded once. "These," she said slowly, turning back to the court, "are records that were filed years ago but never admitted into evidence." Her voice grew sharper, louder, each word slicing through the air. "Hospital records, police reports, statements from witnesses who were later silenced or ignored, and signatures. Signatures that belonged to the defendant, tying him to every one of them." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions to no one, cameras clicked furiously, and spectators gasped as the prosecutor held up a document for all to see. Michael leapt to his feet, shouting over her voice, his lawyer scrambling to drag him back down. "Forgery! Lies! This is fabricated!" he screamed, his voice cracking as though even he no longer believed his own words. The judge pounded his gavel so hard the wood splintered, but even his command for order sounded weak, brittle against the tidal wave of truth crashing over the courtroom. The prosecutor handed the papers to the jury, one by one, letting them see the details for themselves. Their faces shifted from confusion to shock, and finally to something harder, more resolute. They weren't just listening now. They were judging, condemning, writing the story in their minds of a man who had built his life on the suffering of others. I took a breath, my voice carrying over the noise. Those records were real. I gave them to the authorities years ago. They vanished. I begged for them to be used, but they disappeared from the case files. My eyes slid back to the judge, pinning him with the weight of my words. And now we all know why. The silence that followed was heavier than any chaos. Every head turned toward the judge, their gazes sharp, accusing, demanding. His hand trembled as he tried to adjust his papers, his face pale as ash. He cleared his throat, but the sound cracked. "That is a serious accusation," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's not an accusation," I said firmly. "It's the truth. You had those records in your hands once. You knew what they meant. You knew what he had done. And you buried them. You let him walk free." The courtroom gasped as though I had struck the judge across the face. For a long, frozen moment, he sat motionless, his mask of authority shattered by the truth he could no longer outrun. Michael, sensing his chance, leaned forward, his rage momentarily forgotten, his voice dripping with desperation. "She's lying. Judge, you know she's lying. Tell them." His words, meant to save him, only chained him further to the crumbling wall of silence that was collapsing around them both. The prosecutor, emboldened now, slammed her hand on the table. Your Honor, if these documents were indeed withheld, then this is not just a trial about one man's crimes. This is about corruption at the highest level of the court. Her voice echoed, strong and unshakable. The jury deserves to know the truth. The people deserve to know the truth. The judge's gavel fell once more, but his hand shook so violently that the sound was uneven, almost pitiful. His eyes darted around the room, searching for escape, but there was none. He was trapped, by me, by the documents, by his own silence that had protected Michael all these years. His lips parted as though to speak, but no words came. The weight of every eye pressing into him forced him deeper into the very truth he had tried to deny. Michael, sensing the shift, turned feral again. He shouted obscenities, cursed my name, threatened me from across the room. His lawyer tried desperately to contain him, but Michael shoved him aside, his voice rising to a roar. You think this will change anything? You think anyone will believe you? I'll destroy you again, just like I did before. The jury flinched at his words, their expressions hardening with disgust. The prosecutor seized the moment, her voice cutting through his rage like a knife. You just confessed, Mr. Donovan, she said coldly, using his full name with deliberate precision. You confirmed every word she has said. Michael froze, his mouth still open, his rage caught mid-breath. He realized too late that his fury had betrayed him, his own words used as chains to drag him down. He sank back into his seat, his body trembling with rage, his face pale. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the reporters scribbling furiously, the spectators shifting as though they had just witnessed history shift in front of them. And then the final crack came. The judge, unable to hold his silence any longer, slumped slightly in his chair. His voice, when it came, was broken, low, but loud enough for all to hear. She's right, he whispered, and the room froze. His eyes, hollow with years of guilt, lifted to meet mine. I had the records. Buried them. I thought it was the only way to protect my career. I told myself it was just one case. I told myself the system would balance it out. But I was wrong. His words trembled into the silence, but their weight hit like a hammer. The courtroom erupted again, louder than before, chaos spilling out in every direction. The jury stared in disbelief. The prosecutor looked as though she had been struck by lightning, and the reporters nearly climbed over each other to capture every word. Michael screamed, lunging toward the bench, his lawyer and the bailiff wrestling him back. His voice a strangled mess of rage and betrayal. You coward! You traitor! He shouted at the judge, spittle flying from his mouth. But his words no longer mattered. Nothing he said mattered anymore. The truth was out. Not just about Michael. Not just about me. But about the judge, the system, the silence that had poisoned justice for years. I sat there, unflinching, as the storm raged around me. For the first time in years I felt lighter. The scars of my past still burned, but they were no longer chains. The truth had been dragged into the light, and no amount of shouting, no amount of denial, could bury it again. The walls of silence had cracked wide open, and through those cracks, justice was finally stepping in. The courtroom was no longer a place of law and order. It had become a battlefield where truth and corruption clashed in the open, where masks had shattered and reputations burned to ashes. The judge sat slumped in his chair, stripped of the power and dignity he had once wielded with confidence. His confession echoing still in the silence that followed. Michael, restrained by the bailiff, struggled like a wild animal against the grip that held him down. His face twisted with rage. His voice a torrent of curses that no one paid attention to anymore. The jurors, who had watched every moment unfold, no longer wore the expressions of confusion or doubt. They wore the weight of clarity, their eyes heavy with the truth they had been shown. Every secret was now in the open, and there was no turning back. The prosecutor rose to her feet, her papers forgotten, her voice ringing out with newfound authority. Your Honor, she said sharply, though the words were more directed at the system itself than at the trembling man behind the bench. This trial is no longer about argument or doubt. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant has confessed through his own words, and now even the silence that once protected him has admitted guilt. There can be no justice unless the jury delivers what this court has long denied: the truth. The judge, his hands still trembling, barely managed to nod. His voice, once booming with command, came out weak and broken. "The jury will deliberate," he muttered, as if the words themselves stabbed at him, "and deliver its verdict." His gavel fell, though the sound was hollow, stripped of the authority it once carried. The jurors were led out, their faces grave, their shoulders heavy with the burden of deciding not just the fate of one man, but the weight of every silence that had ever been forced upon the innocent. The room buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling, cameras flashing, spectators leaning close to one another as though afraid the truth would vanish if they stopped speaking of it. I sat in my chair, my body exhausted but my spirit finally unchained. For the first time in years, I no longer felt like a victim fighting to be heard. I felt like a survivor standing in the middle of a storm that had tried to break me but had only sharpened my resolve. Michael glared at me across the room, his chest heaving with fury, his eyes burning with the hatred of a man who had lost everything. But there was something else there too, something that made me almost laugh: fear. He was terrified. Not of prison, not of the sentence he knew was coming, but of the world finally seeing him for what he was. The mask he had worn for so long, the mask that had convinced everyone he was untouchable, was shattered beyond repair. And underneath it was nothing but rot. The deliberation took less than 2 hours, though it felt like days stretched into eternity. When the jury filed back in, the silence in the room was suffocating. Even Michael stopped struggling, his body going rigid. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. The foreman stood, a paper trembling in his hand, but his voice steady and strong. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words rang through the courtroom like the toll of a bell that had been silent for too long. Michael's face drained of color, his mouth opening in a silent scream before his rage exploded. He lunged against the bailiffs, screaming obscenities, spitting venom, his voice hoarse and broken. "You can't do this to me. I'm Michael Donovan. You're nothing. She's nothing." His words filled the room, but they no longer carried the power they once did. The jurors stared at him with disgust. The prosecutor stood taller, and I simply watched, my heart calm, my soul steady. He had finally lost, and he knew it. The judge tried to speak, but his voice cracked under the weight of his own disgrace. "The defendant will be remanded into custody until sentencing," he muttered, though no one listened. The focus was not on him anymore. It was on the collapse of Michael Donovan, the man who had believed himself untouchable. The bailiffs dragged him from the courtroom, his voice still echoing in the halls, until at last the doors shut and the silence settled like dust after a storm. Reporters swarmed, questions flying in every direction, cameras flashing as though trying to capture the very air that had shifted in the room. The prosecutor raised her hand, silencing them with a single gesture. She turned to me, her eyes soft now, no longer filled with the sharpness of strategy but with the quiet respect of one who had witnessed something extraordinary. "You did this," she said quietly, though the microphones picked it up. "You broke the silence." I wanted to tell her it hadn't been me alone, that it had been the truth itself, fighting its way into the open, clawing past walls built of lies and corruption. But all I managed was a small nod, my throat too tight to speak. The judge, his shoulders slumped, removed his robe and set it on the bench, his hands shaking as he did so. He didn't look at anyone as he stood, his face hollow, his future already destroyed by the weight of his own confession. Without a word, he left the bench, escorted not by respect but by shame. His silence had finally spoken, and it had ended his career, his power, his mask. The courtroom emptied slowly, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the corridors outside, but I remained seated for a long time, staring at the empty bench where the judge had once sat, at the chair where Michael had once sneered with arrogance. They were just places now, stripped of the power they had once held. The ghosts of silence that had haunted me for so long no longer had a home here. When I finally stood, my body felt lighter, as though I had been carrying a weight that was no longer mine to bear. I stepped out of the courtroom into the blinding light of the afternoon sun. The air was fresh, alive, carrying with it the voices of people speaking the truth openly, without fear. Reporters surged toward me, microphones pushed in my face, questions shouted, but I simply raised a hand and spoke the only words that mattered. The silence is broken. That's all you need to know. The cameras flashed, pens scratched, and the words echoed in the air long after I walked past them, each step carrying me further away from the darkness that had once held me captive. I didn't know what the future would hold. There would be trials still, not in courts but in life, battles to fight, scars to live with. But I knew this. I was no longer defined by what had been done to me. I was defined by what I had survived, by the truth I had carried, by the silence I had finally shattered. And as I walked into the world, free at last from the shadows, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Sparkles, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to Twisted Fate Chronicle for more powerful and shocking stories every week.